I am making an album this summer with a jazz pianist, and I don't know what it really is going to be. I don't know. It'll be an improvised album, and we are using some classical pieces as basis material. They're not really going to be played as they were composed, but I'm even using some pieces by Chopin, some music by Honegger, and there's a piece by Morton Feldman, and none of those things will be heard literally as they were composed, but on top of their bones, we will be adding material, and well, we'll see how it comes out. I don't know.
Is that a duet?
Yeah, it's a two-piano project.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah.
I'm very looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too, but I'm a little worried, of course, because I'm not really an improviser, and I'm certainly not a jazz musician, so it's not going to be a jazz record, but it will have some of those freedoms, I hope, of the way musicians from some disciplines are able to take a pre-existing thing and open it.
Yeah, I mean, just look at bebop jazz scales. A lot we can draw from is very from Chopin even.
Yeah, no, it's
so
true. That's true.
I guess we are jazz pianists in some ways.
Oh, well, I wonder. It is true that many of the 19th century classical piano concertos that we admire so much, Chopin, Liszt, Beethoven, they were incredible improvisers. And you wonder in their written music how many of the practices of improvisation are actually there in the writing. I think certainly with Beethoven, when you look at all those variations that he wrote, that is a kind of document, it's a kind of recording of the way people, Beethoven, improvised. And Chopin too, when you think about all the figurations in one of the concertos or in an elaborate piece of piano music, isn't that the kind of thing that a gifted improviser might have done? And then it also begs the question, if you are giving a performance of those pieces, should you perhaps change it? Should you actually not play precisely what's written down, but maybe the possibility exists of making other changes?
It's always a debate.
It's a debate. I think increasingly in the Viennese classical repertoire, we find people doing that kind of improvisation in Haydn and Mozart. Not so much in Beethoven yet, but for sure, I think that a lot of people feel now that in a Haydn sonata, that if you don't embellish, if you don't decorate, say in a repeat, then there's really no reason to do the repeat. And of course, some of the more conventional classical piano teachers and people in the piano world do not agree with that idea, so you have a kind of friction between people who think you have to do exactly what's written at all times and other people who think that you should not do what's written. But I wonder, I think going forward we are going to be more accepting of an overlap between improvisation and written music. You see it a little bit. There are 2 or 3 younger pianists who are really doing this. There's a Japanese pianist right now who adds things pretty much. There's a young German pianist who I have known a little bit. He just got a contract with Deutsche Grammophon, and along with his first recording, which is written pieces by Scriabin and Scarlatti, but there are also some improvs which are being released as singles, and they're vaguely based on these other pieces of music, but they really are improvs, and I think that's great. I mean, the idea that somebody who was an expert performer of classical music would also improvise, that's great, and would have been pretty radical if you think of, I don't know, 30 or 40 years ago. With a few exceptions, like Friedrich Gulda or somebody like that. Okay, there were always a few people, but that was very, very unusual.
Yeah, I noticed there's a course at the NEC Prep School for improvisations for classical piano pieces.
Yeah, it's great.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I'd like to see more.
Yeah, what additional steps would you probably taken to maybe bridge more gaps between them?
I think that everybody who is a classical performer really should have a strong basis in the substance of music. Does that mean composing? It might. Does it mean improvising? Probably. Does it mean understanding harmonically what's happening in those complicated pieces that we play by Schumann, Ravel, etc.? I think it does. So I think very often classical performers are performing music which they can't really hear. It's beyond their ability to understand by hearing, and some music is very complicated. If you imagine trying to understand harmonically what's going on in a piece of Messiaen or something, okay, that's hard.
Yeah.
But if you can't have some understanding or some sense of what's happening as you're playing it, then your performance, I'm afraid, is going to be very limited, because it's going to be like somebody who learns a language phonetically without understanding what any of the sounds mean. And we understand that that can happen. If you get a text and somebody coaches you, and you might learn to be able to say some lines in Sanskrit or pick your language. But if you don't have any idea of what the sounds represent, it's very difficult to ever really be persuasive. And I think that's really a difficult thing. And in a way, that's what we're always trying to do, I think, in traditional classical music, is to understand the sounds in a way that allows us to communicate them to the audience. But if it's only sounds and we don't know what they signify, it's very hard to do. I am a little concerned that some of those same people who do have a great ability to play known music in the standard repertoire, some of those people don't have very much curiosity about other music or other art. And as a result, I fear that the future is not quite as alive as it should be. That if you think that people learn something very well and they repeat it very well, and then they continue to do that, and then they teach more people to do that, but it doesn't really lead to something which has a life and an evolution. So I'm hoping that we can somehow, in educating young musicians, encourage people to be curious, not necessarily in what they are going to do themselves, but at least in their awareness, so that they have some kind of sense of how the older music that they play fits into a longer development of artistic expression. And I really think that's very important. So curiosity primarily, but then that the curiosity will lead to an exploration and maybe a development of skills. But for the most part, the curiosity itself is the most important thing.
You also mentioned about the importance of imaginations. Can you elaborate more on that?
It's very difficult because it seems like a hard thing to teach, although I wonder sometimes if it isn't possible to stimulate people to be imaginative by asking questions and perhaps by not answering questions. So I think sometimes if we imagine that teaching is the answering of questions, that might be a mistake. It might be better to consider that teaching is a kind of collaborative question asking, and that the teacher has some questions, the student has some questions, and they try to figure out a way to explore those questions and come to some kind of understanding, some kind of informational discovery. But it isn't really a process where there is a final definite answer. And instead it's something that's open-ended and not only representing a change, but something that almost requires a change, so that as the future comes, we can have different answers. Yeah. And I think that's really the important thing, because if you think of classical music as something where all the answers are already known and we're done figuring that out, then I think that's something that's dead. So I don't want that. I want something that still has a lot of unknowns.
Yeah. I think we're just so accustomed to something that we need a final answer, but sometimes we need to be comfortable with the thing that we feel not comfortable with or not clear even with.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's one of the funniest things, I think, which you do see online in some classical music forums or some people online who are presenting classical music, and they speak about the greatest performance of this piece by Rachmaninoff, or the best performance ever given of Chopin's first scherzo. Well, it's an interesting thing to compare a lot of recordings or a lot of performances by historical figures or people of the present. But the idea that there could be some sort of final answer, I think that's really misleading and probably not very useful, because it gives the wrong idea that there is this task. Yes, it's very difficult, and somebody will come along and master this task, and then that's it, we're done. And when you think about other things in human life, in human work, we don't do that. If you go to the Olympics and you see somebody set a world record, you don't say to yourself, well, that's it, nobody will ever go faster than that. Not at all, right? You come back a few years later and you expect a new generation of athletes to do a little better, a little faster, a little higher. Not that music is exactly that, but I think it's not surprising that people continue to make discoveries and come to better understandings of music from the past, because that's what happens in all aspects of human work. Science, if we had the same answers to our medical questions that we had 50 years ago, a lot of us would be dead much sooner, and so we're happy that medicine continues to come up with new answers. So I think we want that in music too. We want that in art. We want that in everything. Why not music that allows us to experience time in different ways? Stockhausen says that one of the things music allows us to do is to experience the kind of consciousness that maybe an insect has, or maybe some kind of bird has. So why should we be limited just to the way a certain kind of human has experienced time and space? Why can't we allow it to be much bigger? And I think some new music does that, so I think that's a good thing. It doesn't mean that the old music isn't still useful or beautiful, but it's just not the only thing. And I find that in classical music, because of that aesthetic, that music should tell a story and be expressive of emotion, that sometimes people adopt very generalized ways of playing that carry out these tasks that they think are appropriate. So you find people making crescendos when the line goes up in pitch, and you find people making little retards when the phrase comes to an end. And those things seem appropriate to the musicians I'm talking about, but they're very generalized. And they don't always have very much to do with the specific music that's being played. So I think that the more we get away from those cliches and those generalized recipes for playing, the more likely we are to actually be able to hear what it is in each piece that is special and unusual about that piece. I think the most interesting music to me is always the music which is an exception to the rules and not just a generalized representation of musical taste. I'm much more interested in somebody, a composer, some kind of sound maker who comes along and does something that I didn't expect. And I think that usually defines beauty, because I think that if something happens which we don't expect, it's much more likely to affect us really strongly than something which is totally expected, no matter how nice it might be. It might be very nice, but if we didn't really feel any surprise, it's probably not really going to be a very excellent experience.
So I know you have been performed widely, from the big hall of the Hollywood scene or to the grandeur of the London's Barbican. So with all these different venues, how do you adapt yourself to all these audiences and new kinds of venues?
That is a very good question, and I feel that it is one of the most interesting things about some of the music that I've been doing in the last years, because I have played in quite a few places now that are not really conventional classical music venues. And the audiences can be very different, and I think that's a very good thing. So, for example, at the Barbican, I did play with Max Cooper, a project we did together which combined live piano playing on an old-fashioned acoustic piano, and at the same time, sounds that were being made by his synthesizers, but they were connected in real time to the sounds that I was making. But the audience for that performance really was people who were coming more from his side of things, more from the electronic music side of things. And I definitely I talked to a couple of people after that performance who said, "Oh, I've never seen anybody play a piano before in a concert." So I found that very interesting, because of course in our world that's pretty ordinary. Gee, there's a person on stage playing a piano. But to these people, that was really something different, and they were accustomed to hearing a DJ or some kind of a electronic artist controlling sounds at a laptop, basically. So this was a combination of that with what I do, and I think it was a provocative experience for some of the people in the audience. So I really think that's a very good thing to do. With the Eno project, I was really hoping to be able to at least appeal to some of Eno's fans who are accustomed to hearing electronic sound, and electronic sound as it's processed and treated in a studio. But now there's this live performance element on top of that, or combined with it. And in that case, one of the strangest things that happens is that in those original versions of Eno's music, there could be repeated phrases of music or repeated sounds, but because they are based on recordings, they are exactly the same every time they happen. So in Music for Airports, there are a couple of phrases which are very obvious, very recognizable. They happen many, many times, but they're always exactly the same. And when I did it, I tried to make my playing the same, but at the same time, I tried to make it not exactly the same. So I really wanted the rhythmic profile of those phrases to vary a little, and ideally to vary in a way that didn't sound like human expression. So I was trying to turn myself into a machine and make it into something that would be slightly irregular, but not the irregularity of rubato expressiveness in classical music. And I think the value of it is that in hearing that, hopefully some listeners would not really notice that those phrases were different, but their listening to the phrases would be affected by the fact that they were not exactly the same. So it's a different experience from hearing the original where the material is exactly the same.
Wow. Now I've become even more looking forward to the collaboration with your jazz pianist, because
yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, because the time will probably feel different.
Yeah.
We'll see. Okay. Thank you, Bruce Brubaker.
Thank you very much. This was an espresso. I think that's Proust's remembrance of things past. Mozart. I think I would have been an artist, maybe a painter or a writer.
Wow.
Venice. That's a dance of the fingers. It's in the Barcarolle, Chopin writes that the thumb slides from a black key to another black key and then to another black key. I usually don't eat dessert, but chocolate is amazing. The pyramids, I would say. Well, I think American Thanksgiving is an amazing holiday, but in my family, there was something I didn't understand, and that was on my birthday, my grandmother would butter my nose.
I'm gonna Google it. Can you please take us to where you work as a piano professor?
Yes. It might be saying yes to a concerto performance, and it was on a concert the next day. I think that's Fellini's Dolce Vita. I think it would be espresso.
Very nice.
That would be from John Cage. I was playing a piece and there was a handwritten chord, very hard to read, very blurry. And I asked him what the notes should be. And he said, listen and you'll know what to do. I think flying.
Flying.
a night owl, but I like the early morning too. I was looking at this new illustration that they put up over there on the wall. Have you seen this?
Oh no!
It's a very
I like the
colorful
colors.
painting of Jordan Hall.